Pakistan is a war zone again. A major showdown is underway. Police have surrounded Imran Khan's home in Lahore. Violent clashes broke out today. Imran Khan's supporters went after the police. Tear gas was fired. And as we speak, the drama continues. Imran Khan faces arrest. Law enforcement officers are closing in. Pakistan's Interior Ministry says he's awaiting orders from the court. Imran Khan has made an appeal to his supporters. He wants them to come out on the streets in large numbers. Remember, this is a country reeling under an economic crisis. A violent power struggle will unleash total chaos. We'll get you the latest from Pakistan on the show tonight. We are also tracking America's banking crisis. It is now hitting the rest of the world, including Indian startups. How big is the impact? We'll tell you about it. And if you complain about IT issues at your workplace, you're not alone. Nearly 50% of the employees lose up to 5 hours every week dealing with technology challenges. That and more coming up ahead. First, the headlines. Fierce war of words over the AUKUS nuclear submarine pact. Australia will buy up to 5 US nuclear-powered submarines to counter China in the Pacific. Beijing has slammed the move. It says the allies are on the path of danger. Russia says the pact will lead to years of confrontation in Asia. Fallout of the Tosha Khana gifts row. Pakistan bans its president, prime minister, judges and military officers from retaining gifts above $300. Gifts over that value received from foreign dignitaries will become state property. China will finally reopen its borders to tourists. All types of visas will be issued starting Wednesday. Beijing closed its borders 3 years ago due to the pandemic. It hopes this move will boost its flagging economy. Strike season continues in the UK. Thousands of doctors are on a 3-day strike over their pay. It's the latest stir to hit the state-funded National Health Service following walkouts by nurses and paramedics. The Lebanese pound sinks to a historic low against the dollar, trading at 100,000 against the greenback. The latest setback comes as banks in the crisis-hit country resume their strike. The drama in Pakistan just refuses to end. Former Prime Minister Imran Khan is facing arrest. It's just a question of when now. The Pakistani establishment wants to put him behind bars. There was high drama in Lahore today, scenes of utter chaos. The site of action was Zaman Park. This is where Imran Khan's residence is. A heavy contingent of police reached here this afternoon. They're trying hard to make their way into Imran Khan's residence to arrest him. But they've been struggling. The police contingent is moving forward with the help of an armoured vehicle to reach Imran Khan's residence. They're being blocked by members of Imran Khan's party, the PTI. The armoured vehicle tried dispersing them using water cannons. Then the police took to firing tear gas shells, but PTI supporters refused to budge. They've flooded the area in an attempt to save their leader. Zaman Park now looks like a war zone. Imran Khan supporters are putting up a tough fight. The police seem determined to get the former Prime Minister today, and they have the government's backing. Pakistan's Interior Minister Rana Sanaullah has issued a statement. He says Imran Khan will be arrested on the orders of the court. There are many cases pending against him. In one of them, there was a non-bailable arrest warrant. Last week, the Islamabad High Court suspended that warrant, meaning the former Prime Minister got a sigh of relief. But the relief was short-lived. On Monday, another court restored this arrest warrant, a non-bailable arrest warrant. And that has paved the way for Imran Khan's arrest. He filed an exemption plea on the same day, citing security threats. And on this pretext, he did not appear before the court. He said his life was in danger. But the court took offense. It ordered the police to arrest Imran Khan and present him before the court on the 18th of March. Islamabad police was happy to comply. It has been waiting for an opportunity to get him. The officer leading the arrest team is DIG Shehzad Bukhari. I have a quote from him too. He says, "We have come to comply with the warrant. We know the details of the case but cannot discuss." Imran Khan, meanwhile, has posted a video message on Twitter. This is what he said.
मेरे पाकिस्तानियों, पुलिस मुझे जेल में पकड़ने के लिए आ गई है बाहर। और उनका ये ख्याल है कि जब इमरान खान जेल में चला जाएगा तो कौम सो जाएगी। आपने इनको गलत साबित करना है। आपने ये साबित करना है कि ये जिंदा कौम है।
And now to why Imran Khan faces arrest. The former Prime Minister of Pakistan faces multiple charges. The police are looking to arrest him in the Tosha Khana case. Tosha Khana is the state depository. It keeps expensive gifts given to Pakistani officials by foreign dignitaries. During his stint as Prime Minister, Imran Khan got many such gifts, expensive items, including watches by top officials in the Gulf. They should have been deposited in the Tosha Khana, but Imran Khan is said to have taken them from the depository and then he's said to have sold them illegally at high profits. Reports say he made 36 million rupees from the sale of premium watches alone. And for the record, it is compulsory for Pakistani officials to deposit such expensive gifts to the Tosha Khana. So if the charges are true, Imran Khan broke the law and engaged in brazen corruption. But are the charges true? It doesn't matter. The odds are stacked against Imran Khan. The Pakistan government is led by his political opponents. He has lost favor with the army as well. Khan is openly challenging the generals in Pakistan. In fact, he called for a probe against former army chief General Bajwa. So basically, in the power circles of Pakistan, Imran Khan has no friends left. The hammer was just waiting to come down on him. But the cricketer turned politician remains defiant. He has dismissed all the cases against him. And by the way, this is not the first time the police have reached his doorstep to arrest him. Earlier this month, the Islamabad police came to Lahore with an arrest warrant, but Imran Khan was nowhere to be found. The police returned empty-handed. This is a dangerous game of cat and mouse. Imran Khan remains a very popular leader. But Pakistan's democracy is a farce. The generals control everything and they routinely punish prime ministers for behaving like prime ministers. Imran Khan is their latest victim. Once selected by the army to become prime minister, now hounded by the same army. America's banking crisis is snowballing. 2 US banks have collapsed and now the crisis is hitting the rest of the world. Yesterday, the US president tried to calm nerves. Joe Biden said the depositors will be made whole, meaning they'll get their money back, and that the US taxpayers will not foot the bill for this. But what about the others? What about people in other countries who are also suffering the consequences? Let me tell you how big the fallout is. The failure of American banks has led to a loss of over $400 billion the world over. $400 billion. This is the loss in financial stocks worldwide, and the bleeding is still on amid a crisis of confidence. So how is India faring? How much are Indian companies exposed to this crisis? Well, there are some, and India has not been unaffected by all of this. Tonight we'll discuss which companies have been hit and how much. But first, an update on what's happening in the US. The American banking system is still reeling. On Monday, customers were still lining up outside SVB, the Silicon Valley Bank, the first bank that failed in this crisis. Government officials tried to contain the panic. Remember, American regulators have now taken control of the bank. They are the ones in charge, and they're trying to revive the bank. Yesterday, some officials stepped out to meet customers. They bought donuts and coffee and offered words of reassurance.
You will be able to transact business as usual. Your accounts are safe. Your online portals are active. You'll be able to wire and do business as usual. So if you have any questions, feel free to let us know.
So what's happening at SVB right now? The bank is running, but it's not fully operational. They've got a new CEO. Reports say customers have got access to their deposits, but they cannot make cross-border transactions yet. It will take a few more days for the bank to resume all its services. And this is bad news for some startups in India. Like I said, Indian companies have also some kind of exposure to this bank. Some Indian startups had accounts in Silicon Valley, and now their money could be stuck. How many companies are we talking about? More than 60, according to one claim. And how much money is stuck here? We do not have the exact figure, but each of these companies has more than $250,000 in their accounts, and out of these, nearly 24 startups have more exposure, meaning at least 24 companies have more money in the bank. We're talking about more than $1 million each. This money is stuck. And which companies are these? We do not have the names. They've not been revealed yet because this disclosure will hurt them. Apparently, their investors are afraid. They're worried that if the names come out, it will hurt the companies in future fundraising. And who are these investors? The likes of Y Combinator, Accel, Sequoia India, Lightspeed, SoftBank, and Bessemer Venture Partners. These are all venture capital firms. Basically, they're big investors in startups, and this is a testing time for them. Imagine if one of these companies has to pay salaries in India with the money stuck in America, or if they have to settle vendor payments here, or bills of any other kind. As of today, they cannot do it from Silicon Valley Bank. That's because the bank is yet to resume cross-border transactions. And this bank is central to their businesses. Like I told you yesterday, Silicon Valley was the top banker for America's tech industry. Also for many venture capitalists, many startups put their first checks in Silicon Valley. The past few days have been a nightmare for them. Here's an American entrepreneur sharing his horror story.
The last 72 hours has been sort of an extreme version of that. I mean, not knowing whether or not the company you've spent 5 years building was going to go away overnight as a result of something as, I think, sort of unpredictable as a collapse of a bank was really hard.
And here's the scariest part. Silicon Valley could be just the tip of the iceberg. America's banking industry at large remains vulnerable. That's because this collapse is linked to US treasuries or US government bonds. Again, we talked about this yesterday. Silicon Valley Bank had a lot of cash. It invested this money in government bonds. But last year, when the US Federal Reserve hiked interest rates, it issued new bonds. These new bonds offered higher interest rates, and that made the old bonds less valuable. Their value declined sharply. And that's a problem for a lot of American banks because many of them still hold the old government bonds. They paid a lot of money for these old bonds. But now if they sell them, they'll not be able to recover that money. In other words, they're sitting on a pile of losses. Do you know how much? Losses worth a whopping $620 billion. This is what American banks are staring at. Over $600 billion in losses. But I must say here, these are unrealized losses, meaning they exist only on paper as of today. The US banks still hold the old bonds. They don't have to sell them immediately. The banks can wait for the value of the bonds to go up. They can choose to sell them only when the value is up. That way they won't make losses. But if they decide to sell the bonds now, there will be suffering. And this is one of the big reasons why everyone is spooked. This is why investors are worried. They fear that the banks would take more losses. So they're dumping their investments. Shares are being dumped across the board. The result is this. Global financial stocks have plunged. Banking stocks from Japan to South Korea to Australia and, of course, America are seeing a sea of red. In 2 days, they have lost $465 billion in their market value. In 2 days. The next few days could be tough. The global banking system remains on the edge. Meanwhile, China is working on a new project. Xi Jinping wants to be the man of peace. And no, this is not a change of heart. He just wants to score political points. And this is not peace for his neighbors. Xi Jinping wants to mediate in the Russia-Ukraine war. He's making a push for talks. China has gone into a diplomatic overdrive. Their president wants to speak to the leaders of Ukraine and Russia. Xi Jinping plans to speak to Zelensky virtually, and then he'll meet Vladimir Putin in person. And this dialogue could happen as soon as next week. Reports say the Chinese president will first travel to Moscow. There he will meet the Russian president, and after that he will call the Ukrainian president. This would be a first. Xi Jinping has not spoken to Volodymyr Zelensky since the war began last year. With the Russians, though, he's been in regular touch. So if the call with Zelensky happens, it will be significant. China will position itself as a mediator in the war. The question is why? What explains Xi Jinping's urgency? Perhaps the events in West Asia. Remember, he took credit for the truce between Saudi Arabia and Iran. China hosted the final round of peace talks. Even though other intermediaries were involved, China took all the credit. Beijing declared that it was the one that brokered the peace pact. Perhaps they want a repeat in Ukraine, and China stands to gain a lot with this. The idea is to present a new world order, one that is led by China instead of the West. At least that's the ambition. China is already pitching itself as the good guy and painting the West as the driver of the conflict.
Regrettably, efforts to persuade peace and promote talks have been consistently undermined. It seems there's an invisible hand pushing for the protraction and escalation of the conflict, using the Ukrainian crisis to serve certain geopolitical agendas.
The invisible hand, says the Chinese foreign minister. No prizes for guessing who he's talking about. The United States of America. China is suggesting that it can do a better job. And that's the first reason why it wants to mediate. Reason number two, China wants to seek leverage against the US. Remember, the US has been trying to contain China by slapping sanctions. It has been trying to move the global supply chains away from China. Beijing wants to stop this. It wants to stop the exodus of businesses, and ending the Ukraine war would give China an opening. An opportunity, basically, to stitch new alliances, to reboot ties with Europe, for instance. In fact, reports say when the Chinese president travels to Russia, he may make a few stops in Europe too. It will be quite something. A diplomatic comeback of sorts. After 3 years in a virtual lockdown, the Chinese president will be touring multiple countries. The plans are yet to be finalized, and the United States is watching closely. Washington is sending a message to the Chinese president about this upcoming visit to Moscow. Listen to what's being said. We have been encouraging President Xi, this is the US saying, we have been encouraging President Xi to reach out to President Zelensky because we believe the PRC and President Xi himself should hear directly the Ukrainian perspective and not just the Russian perspective on this. Earlier this year, China pushed a so-called peace plan for Ukraine, and Kiev was not even consulted about it, which is why the West has been skeptical about China's moves. But to say they're the ones encouraging China is a bit much. And the West may not agree to Xi Jinping's peace plan. It's very unlikely to fly. Then why would Xi Jinping still want to get involved in this? Because even an attempt to intervene could bring him good press, both at home and outside. You see, China's domestic troubles are mounting, and the Chinese have started blaming the West for it. The government has. This is all an attempt to build a new narrative. Look at Xi Jinping's recent speech. He uses words like containment, encirclement, suppression. All of it is to paint China as a victim and America as the perpetrator. And now this rivalry could play out in the battleground of Ukraine. Let's hope it doesn't make things worse. Meanwhile, in The Hague, the ICC is on a mission. The ICC is the International Criminal Court. The Hague is a city in the Netherlands. The court is opening new cases against Russia. Cases for war crimes in Ukraine. Is this a purely political move? Can this court really hold Russia accountable? Has it done so with any other country in the past? What are its powers? What is the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court? And does Russia have a reason to be worried? We'll tackle these questions one by one. Also, if the ICC has shown such enthusiasm in investigating war crimes committed by countries in the West, like the military invasion of Iraq, crimes committed by the US and the UK, they've bombed the life out of entire countries. What did the ICC do then? We'll discuss all of it, starting with Russia's case. Arrest warrants against Russian individuals will be issued soon. These are individuals suspected of committing war crimes in Ukraine. The ICC wants to put Russia in the dock for two major reasons. Number one, the abduction of Ukrainian children, and number two, the targeting of civilian infrastructure across Ukraine. Next question. What is the ICC? Like I said, the International Criminal Court, it investigates and prosecutes war criminals, or so we are told. It focuses on 4 types of crime: genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, and crimes of aggression. The ICC draws its power from the Rome Statute of 1998. It's a treaty that created this court. 123 countries recognize the ICC and accept its jurisdiction. 40 countries do not. And this list includes countries like China, India, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and others. So what kind of power does the ICC have? Like I said, it can investigate and prosecute war criminals, but there are 2 conditions. First, the country where the offence was committed must recognize the court's jurisdiction. And second, the country where the criminal comes from, the supposed criminal, must also recognize the court's jurisdiction. And that's where this gets murky. Because Russia considers the ICC as an illegitimate entity. It says this court is a tool of Western colonialism. Ukraine, on the other hand, sees the ICC as an institution that can punish Russia. Ukraine recognizes this court's jurisdiction, Russia does not. And so it's very unlikely that Russia or Russians will be punished, because the ICC will not try supposed criminals in absentia. They have to be present in the court for the trial. And Russia is never going to allow that. It won't give up its citizens to the ICC for this trial. So this trial is DOA, dead on arrival. Maybe just a political statement then. And by the way, there's another country that the ICC does not have jurisdiction over, even though it played a crucial role in drafting the treaty that created this court. That country is the United States. It does not recognize the International Criminal Court, and not without good reason. The US has invaded countries left, right, and center. It wages one war after another. That's what keeps its military-industrial complex running. More wars need more weapons, and America makes more money. That's how it works. Why does the US not recognize this court? A guilty conscience, perhaps, and a long list of war crimes. In fact, the US is not even willing to provide intelligence to this International Criminal Court. Intelligence that could incriminate Russia, the US will not give it. Why? The Pentagon says it would set a precedent and pave the way for American soldiers to be held accountable. It's another shining example of American hypocrisy for you. And it's not like the International Criminal Court is a beacon of justice. If it were, war crimes committed in a host of other countries would have also been investigated. War criminals from around the world would have been prosecuted. And there is no shortage of wars for this court to probe. Let me name a few. The Iraq War, the Afghanistan War, the carpet bombing of former Yugoslavia, the interventions in Somalia, and I haven't even begun scratching the surface yet. What has the ICC done to investigate war crimes in all of these cases? We tried to find out. And all we found was one isolated investigation that relates to Afghanistan. That probe too is stalled. What about the other wars? It's like they never happened. As of March last year, the ICC had indicted 40 people, 40. All of them belong to Africa. And this is not to say that there are no war crimes being committed in Ukraine. There are. Investigate them by all means. But don't target one country and give a free pass to the others. The law may be blind, the world is not. Vantage continues after a short break.
Yeah, so for whatever it's worth, elections are the ultimate marker in an electoral democracy. And the fact is that in elections, the Congress party is just not able to win elections.
Yes, I agree with you that elections are an important marker, but not the only marker. Okay. And attempts are being made in states where verdict goes against.
And now let me tell you about a concept that has stirred a hornet's nest. Swiss neutrality. It's an old concept. Switzerland refuses to take sides in a conflict, but the war in Ukraine is testing it. In the early days of the war, Switzerland gave in to Western pressure. It sanctioned Russia. But now the West wants more. It wants Switzerland to send arms to Ukraine. Remember, Switzerland is a vital manufacturing hub for weapons, and the West wants to send these weapons to Ukraine. But will the Swiss agree? Our next report tells you where they stand on the latest demand.
Switzerland's foreign policy faces a dilemma. It's a 500-year-old principle, the principle of neutrality. It's self-imposed, and it has now stoked an angry debate in the country and outside. The Ukraine war is testing Swiss neutrality. Switzerland is a major hub of weapons manufacturing. The West wants it to send these weapons to Ukraine, but Bern has denied permission. Its law bars Swiss-made weapons to be sent into war zones. The Swiss president says, and I quote, "Swiss weapons must not be used in wars. It is precisely because we are neutral and do not allow the transfer of weapons to war zones that we can do a great deal for this continent. Pacifism has a bad reputation right now, but warfare is not part of the Swiss DNA." So Switzerland is firm in its denial, and European powers are not happy about this. Germany and France in particular. There's criticism from Swiss lawmakers too. They believe their country should stand with Ukraine. Earlier this month, Swiss parliament voted to allow the transfer of Swiss-made weapons to Ukraine. It was passed with a razor-thin majority of 98 votes. But the proposal has inserted a tricky condition. It says Switzerland will send weapons only if the UN Security Council declares the Russian invasion illegal. With Moscow's veto powers at the UNSC, that is unlikely to happen. Meanwhile, Swiss citizens are weighing in too. As per a poll, 55% of them support sending arms to Ukraine. Another anguished party are Swiss weapon manufacturers. They say they're losing out on bulk orders in the market, more specifically, orders from Europe. In 2022, Swiss-made arms worth $1 billion were exported around the world. This was up from 29% the year before. But shipments to Europe fell. From about two-thirds in 2021, it now only got about half of Swiss-made arms. Western officials say Switzerland is being ignorant and indifferent to the plight of Ukraine. Bern does not agree.
Switzerland is a neutral country. Neutrality does not mean indifference. The violation of international law is a violation that Switzerland condemns while being a neutral country. Killing people, massacring people, has nothing to do with neutrality.
So what is it, Switzerland's neutrality principle? It was adopted in the year 1515. The old Swiss Confederacy lost the Battle of Marignano to the French. Around 10,000 Swiss fighters lost their lives. Since the setback, the Swiss decided to stay neutral in all conflicts. That principle was formally codified in the Hague Convention of 1907. The agreement required neutral states to refrain from engaging in war, ensure its own defense, and not supply mercenary tools to belligerent states. The world witnessed 2 world wars after that. Yet, Switzerland proudly calls itself neutral. It got its fair share of criticism too. During the Second World War, it shut its doors to Jewish refugees. Swiss financial institutions are said to have been a financial safe haven for the Nazis. They parked their wealth safely in Swiss banks. Similar instances have been reported during the Iraq War, and the biggest of all was during the apartheid in South Africa. Switzerland, unlike much of the world then, continued its economic ties with the regime. But most recently in Ukraine, Switzerland was seen cleverly sidestepping its neutrality rule. 4 days into the war, the country buckled under Western pressure and sanctioned Russia.
Russia's attack against Ukraine is unacceptable with regards to international law, politically speaking and morally. The Federal Council has decided to fully adopt European Union sanctions, including asset freezing.
This was a first for Switzerland. Interestingly, it didn't impose any sanctions on Russia when Moscow annexed Crimea in 2014. 2022 was a shift. The West is pushing for more. Ukraine is running short on ammunition. Many of the weapons and ammunition the West supplies to Kyiv have their roots in Switzerland. Will Switzerland relent? This is a developing story.
So Switzerland's neutrality is being tested, but the United Kingdom has no such problems. It is picking clear sides, especially in the fight against China. The UK is ramping up its military spending. It is arming allies, even deploying military assets in the region to take on China. Let me tell you how. We'll start with the UK's military budget. Prime Minister Rishi Sunak has decided to expand it. Over the next 2 years, the UK will spend $6 billion more on defence. Where will the money go? Mostly to 3 areas. The UK will replenish its ammunition stocks, modernize its nuclear submarine program, and fund the next phase of AUKUS. That's the military alliance of Australia, the UK and the US, AUKUS, AUKUS.
The threats to our security have increased, and that's why we're investing £5 billion more in our world-beating armed forces over the next 2 years.
And which threats was Rishi Sunak talking about? Russia, certainly, but more importantly, China. The UK's foreign policy is witnessing a clear shift, and Sunak is taking a more hawkish stand against China. The plan is to counter the dragon in every theatre possible. I told you about the AUKUS. Yesterday, the alliance unveiled a new roadmap. The three partners will make nuclear submarines. The leaders met in San Diego in the US. They announced a new agreement. Australia is buying 3 nuclear submarines with an option to purchase 2 more in the future. Australia and the UK will design the new subs, and America will supply the technology. The submarines will be built in Barrow, England. And this is just one part of the alliance. They want to expand the agreement. They want to build artificial intelligence capabilities, hypersonic weapons, and other advanced technology. Where will these submarines operate? Again, Rishi Sunak had the answer.
This is a powerful partnership. For the first time ever, it will mean 3 fleets of submarines working together across both the Atlantic and Pacific, keeping our oceans free, open, and prosperous for decades to come.
The Atlantic and the Pacific. China wants to expand its sphere of influence in both these regions. AUKUS plans to counter that with submarines, but they will take time to build. Until then, the allies have come up with a stopgap arrangement. Both the UK and the US will send their submarines to Australia. They will serve in rotation at a naval base near Perth. A name has been given to this initiative. It will be called Submarine Rotational Force West. Needless to say, China is not thrilled about any of it.
The latest joint communique issued by the US, UK and Australia indicates the 3 countries have gone further and further down a wrong and dangerous road for their own selfish political gains, in complete disregard of the concerns of the international community.
Wrong and dangerous, that's how Beijing describes AUKUS. We wonder what China would say about this one. Britain working with Taiwan. Taipei is upgrading its naval forces and London wants to help. The UK is stepping up military exports to the island of Taiwan. It will send more submarine parts and technology. What kind of parts? We don't have a full list, but experts say these exports will improve Taiwan's defenses against China. So the trajectory is quite clear. The UK finally sees China as a threat, and Prime Minister Rishi Sunak has no plans to strike a balance. He is leaving no opportunity to challenge China. In fact, he brought up the origins of the Wuhan virus too. The British Prime Minister was asked about the recent American assessments, the ones that claim that the virus could have come from a Chinese lab. Sunak said he does not rule out a lab leak himself. Let me quote, "There's clearly questions that need to be answered. I'd certainly say that, and we haven't ruled anything out at this stage. I think what we want to see and fully support is a proper scientific inquiry as to the origins, and we would urge everyone, including China, to cooperate with that investigation." China is not expected to relent on that front. But the message for Beijing is quite clear. It has no friend in the Sunak government. And why is Rishi Sunak taking such a tough stand now? It's hard to say. Perhaps to boost his approval ratings, or to avoid a diplomatic isolation, or both. Either way, it's a hard shift. We say better late than never. Speaking of which, there may be a shift in Israel's equations with the US. The Netanyahu government is under pressure. Israel is seeing its biggest protest ever, and now the government says it could be America's doing. It's quite a charge, and it came from a top aide of the Prime Minister. He's given no proof to back his claim, but he set the cat among the pigeons with this one. Let me start with a recap of what's happening in Israel. 500,000 people are out on the streets protesting. They're against the government's controversial judicial reforms. The new rules will give the Prime Minister a bigger say in picking judges. Remember, he faces cases himself. And this kind of power could give him undue influence over courts. That's what critics say, and people are protesting. Former military chiefs are warning about a possible civil war, but the Prime Minister is not willing to relent. Protesters say Israel is becoming a dictatorship and that they're out on the streets to protect democracy. Can Netanyahu survive this? 500,000 protesters turning up in a country of 9 million people. That's almost 5% of the country's population out on the streets. It's unprecedented. These protesters are carrying the Israeli flag, chanting slogans like, "Israel will not be a dictatorship."
I'm here to demonstrate and to sound my voice against the dictatorship that they're established here. in the name of the so-called law, judicial reform. It's not a judicial reform. It's a revolution that's making Israel go to full dictatorship. And I want Israel to stay a democracy for my kids, for my grandson that will be here, because Israel is a democracy country and it must stay as one.
It's a revolution, they say, and it sure looks like one. They're protesting against the Prime Minister's proposed judicial reform, the one that will give Israel's parliament, the Knesset, the power to overturn Supreme Court decisions with a simple majority. The government will be able to nominate judges. Let me show you the results from a poll conducted last month. 2 out of 3 Israelis believe the Supreme Court should retain the power to strike down laws. That's 66% of all Israelis. Almost the same number of people want the existing system of appointing judges to continue, almost 63% Israelis. But the government sees a foreign hand in this. Netanyahu and his aides believe it is the United States, Israel's top ally and security partner. Reports say Israel's government believes it is funding, the US is funding and orchestrating these anti-Netanyahu protests. I have a quote from a senior Israeli government official. This is what he said. This protest is financed and organized with millions of dollars. We are following what is happening. This is a very high-level organization. Who finances the transportation, the flags, the stages? It is clear to us. This official was traveling along with Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to Italy recently. Another official on the same entourage confirmed that the US was behind the protests. And it's a big claim, though not a first for the US to be charged with something like this. The Americans have a record of orchestrating regime-changing protests. But coming from Israel, this is serious. It could have serious ramifications. The US has supported Israel for decades, military aid, intelligence sharing, ideological support. And now an accusation comes flying from Israel that the US is trying to overthrow a democratically elected government. Either Netanyahu and his aides are very sure that Washington has a role to play here, or they're just trying to deflect attention and ease pressure. And if Netanyahu is indeed accusing the US of orchestrating these protests just to deflect attention, the consequences could be severe. Remember, the Americans have been watching what's happening here. US Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin visited Israel last week. You know what he said? He asked Israel's leadership to take steps to reduce tensions in the West Bank. Violence has been on the rise in this region. Israel has been conducting regular raids. Basically, Austin was asking the Israelis to rethink their approach in the West Bank. Then there's the US envoy to Israel. He says Netanyahu should, quote-unquote, pump the brakes on the judicial overhaul. So there's a very visible difference here. And there have been some differences for a while now. Israel's accusation has the potential to widen the rift. Prime Minister Netanyahu is caught in a very tricky position. Reservists who form the backbone of Israel's military are threatening to not serve. And that could become a big problem for the Prime Minister. There are also fissures within the Israeli government, between the government and the bureaucracy. And the cherry on the cake, Israel's president has asked the Prime Minister to take the proposed law off the table. Clearly, the rift goes right to the top, and Prime Minister Netanyahu faces the challenge of a lifetime. China is battling a new disease outbreak and talking about a fresh round of lockdowns. This time it's influenza. Official data says there are 400 cases, but we know a thing or two about how China maintains data, so discount that. The flu has been spreading for 6 weeks now. The positivity rate is over 40%, and pharmacies are set to be running out of medicines. This is almost a repeat of what China saw during the last wave of the Wuhan virus. And the prospect of another lockdown has caused a lot of anger. Citizens are pushing back as the world wonders what and how much the Chinese are hiding this time. Here's a report.
A familiar story is playing out in China. Another disease outbreak, a drug shortage, days of remote learning for children, and prospects of a lockdown. No, this isn't the Wuhan virus we're talking about, it's the influenza outbreak. China has been seeing a steady rise in cases of flu since February. On last count, China recorded 390 cases of flu. The positivity rate jumped from 41.6% from 25.1% in 1 week. But given Beijing's tendency of suppressing data, the real figure remains unclear. Influenza A, which is the common flu virus, is said to have been responsible for 99% of the flu cases detected in China. Its symptoms include fever, aches, headaches, and diarrhea. The WHO says the rise in infections is due to simultaneous transmission of two influenza A virus subtypes. One is the H1N1 and the other is H3N2. The flu, however, is reportedly seasonal. It's also been noticed in other countries. But in China's case, it's taking a toll on school-going children.
My child vomited twice yesterday. The child has had a fever of up to 40 degrees for several days. Today the doctor will check whether he has influenza A.
The rise in flu cases comes weeks after China witnessed a deadly COVID wave. Millions are said to have died then. Doctors, however, have ruled out another wave of COVID infections. They say the rise is due to low immunity levels.
For school-age children, about 20% to 30% of them test positive for influenza A. The current situation does not seem to be another wave of COVID-19 infections.
Because school children have been taking online classes for a good part of the past 3 years, their existing immunity and antibody levels are relatively low. So when they return to school, they could be prone to infectious diseases such as influenza.
The latest outbreak has sent alarm bells ringing. Populous cities like Shanghai, Beijing, Tianjin and Ningbo have switched to online classes for students. Some want to take it a step forward. Take Xi'an, for instance. It has a population of roughly 13 million. Officials have warned of a lockdown if things get out of hand. Municipal authorities in Xi'an last week presented a 4-level response system. This keeping in mind the severity of the situation. If the outbreak gets worse, authorities say they're prepared to enforce pandemic-style lockdowns to curb the infections. That's right, a lockdown for a flu outbreak. And it seems it has already taken the first step in this process. On Wednesday, it issued an emergency notice to local authorities. It permitted them to shut schools, businesses, and entertainment centers. But residents are having none of it. For them, it's a flashback to the nightmare they witnessed in 2021. You see, China's radical measures are no secret. In 2015, authorities in Shanghai had warned of stopping classes, work, and restricting gatherings in the event of an influenza outbreak. During the outbreak of the Wuhan virus too, China saw one of the strictest lockdowns in the world. This was in line with the country's zero-COVID policy. Citizens forcefully locked for days without access to daily essentials. The situation in Xi'an was no different. It suffered a draconian lockdown between December 2021 and January 2022. Many were left starving due to the lack of essentials, and medical services were affected for weeks together. But citizens lost patience after a point. After almost 2 years of strict lockdowns, large-scale protests were witnessed on the streets of China calling for an end to restrictions. China's zero-COVID approach had evidently failed.
I think we just need to identify the close contacts or semi-close contacts, those people who might have been infected. This is just enough. We don't need this huge screening of the whole compound. It's not necessary to be so meticulous.
Chinese social media websites are flooded with messages. Angry citizens are pleading to authorities not to go down that path again. They say that similar outbreaks have happened in the past and life has gone on. While there is no news of a complete lockdown, the distrust of the citizens in the local authorities remains high. They don't want to see a repeat of the pandemic restrictions.
Now let's talk about another disaster. US President Joe Biden has dropped a bomb on the planet. Not the conventional kind, but a carbon bomb. He's approved an oil drilling project in the state of Alaska. It's called the Willow Oil Drilling Project. It's an $8 billion project. It's expected to produce almost 600 million barrels of oil. This will be done over 30 years, and this exposes America's climate hypocrisy. 600 million barrels of oil. Imagine the greenhouse gas emissions. So much to fight climate change. The project will scupper all the gains made by Biden's Inflation Reduction Act. not to mention the potential damage to local wildlife and, of course, the indigenous communities living near the drill site. Do you remember what Joe Biden promised not very long ago? Let me quote what he said. No more drilling on federal lands, period. That's what he said. So why did he change his mind? The justification is laughable and the double standards staggering. First, let me tell you about the project. This will be handled by a Texas-based oil firm called ConocoPhillips. In 2019, it made news, this company. It was ranked as the 14th most polluting company in the world. Now, this company will handle the Willows project. It will drill for oil and gas at 3 different sites in Alaska. This is in America's National Petroleum Reserve. It is owned by the US government. Like I said, the project will yield close to 600 million barrels of oil over 30 years. Production is expected to peak at 180,000 barrels of crude oil per day. Let's pause for a second. 180,000 barrels a day is not insignificant, but it's also not a lot. Let me give you context. The US, Russia and Saudi Arabia have each been producing between 9 to 11 million barrels a day since 2014. Compared to 11 million barrels, 180,000 is nothing. This new project would bump US oil production by less than 2%. But that does not take away from the damage it could cause. Burning all those barrels of oil will release millions of tons of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. It would erase Biden's progress towards renewable energy. And then there's the Alaskan environment. This is what environmental groups have to say about the project.
Community most impacted by this project is Nuiqsut, and they are opposed to the project because of the numerous harms that it will cause them. I mean, they're already dealing with gas leaks, oil spills, toxic pollution from the existing oil and gas infrastructure that's already in the area, and this will only cause more harm.
So the drawbacks are severe and the benefits questionable. Then why is Biden going through with the project? It's the usual justifications: more jobs for Alaska, development, billions added to the economy, the same old drivel. The latest justification is that it will ease energy prices exacerbated by the Ukraine war, which makes no sense whatsoever. It will take years for this project to take off. And remember the figure of 180,000 barrels a day. That's about 0.2% of the global daily oil production in 2021. How on earth will this affect oil prices? But maybe this is just the first step. After all, once the roads and pipelines are laid, what stops other companies from drilling in this remote region? And where does this leave Biden's pro-climate pitch? He put new bans on oil and gas leasing in the Arctic Ocean. He reduced the amount of land available for extraction in Alaska, and now he allows a drilling project. The logic doesn't add up, but the political math makes sense. Biden wants to run for president again in 2024. He has to woo neutral voters ahead of that. No matter how much progressive, climate-conscious Americans fume, they are not going to vote Republican. But opening this oil field will send neutral voters a message that President Biden cares about reducing fuel prices, that he's looking out for the common man. And this cynical political game is going to cost the rest of the world. It also exposes American hypocrisy. The US chastises India and China for using fossil fuels for growth. Then it turns around and does the very same thing. A Democratic Party lawmaker from Alaska said, and I'm quoting, "Alaska cannot carry the burden of solving our global warming problems alone." This is what the leader said. But it's not Alaska alone. It's all of America. The US has been among the world's worst polluters for decades. So this is not Alaska's burden. It is America's responsibility to not make things worse. If you work in an office, any office, this story is for you. It is about tech issues at work. Raise your hand if you've been a victim. Or never mind, let's commiserate. How much time do you lose to technology issues? Does it feel like the IT department is ghosting you? Do you have to constantly hound them? Do you find yourself logged out of the system after failed password attempts? Does your computer decide to hang right before an important presentation? Does it feel like the office printer has personal vendetta against you? Can it smell fear, or does it just hate you? All I can say is that you're not alone. In this time-starved world, we are all terminally tech-frustrated. And IT issues don't just fill us with murderous thoughts, they also kill productivity. Listen to this. Nearly half of employees lose 1 to 5 hours every week dealing with IT issues. This was estimated in a recent survey, 1 to 5 hours every week. This translates to about 11 days a year. 11 days of lost productivity due to technology. Just think about all the things you could have done during this lost time, all the meetings you could have attended, all the lost chances to say, wow, that meeting should have been an email. And they say time is money. At minimum wage, this is costing each worker in the US over $1,900 every year. It costs each worker in the UK about $3,000 every year. What about India? About 47,000 rupees or $560 because we're talking about minimum wage. Moral of the story, everyone suffers a loss. But does your boss care that tech issues stopped you from meeting the deadline? Data says probably not. 42% employers do not take IT issues into account when measuring productivity. You see, technology at work can be a double-edged sword. It is usually an enormous time saver, but it can be draining if it is not working well. Sometimes staff doesn't know how to use the tools provided to them. That's because we are now using more technology than ever before, and it keeps changing all the time. We attend office workshops to understand the latest tech, but soon that tech becomes obsolete and we find ourselves learning the bells and whistles of the latest tech replacement. Another problem is generational differences. Not a sweeping statement, but it's definitely a trend. Millennial employees see far higher value in chatbots and virtual whiteboards. Then we have Gen Z, the generation born between the late 1990s and early 2010s. They face something called tech shame at work. It refers to how overwhelmed young people feel when using basic office tools. 1 in 5 young workers feels this way. They grew up fiddling with apps on their phones, but the humble office printer or scanner can seem daunting to them. And all of this gets worse when you're working from home. Then you're on your own. And sometimes slow technology can cause privacy concerns. According to a survey last year, 79% people switched to their personal devices after facing tech concerns. So what should companies do? They should listen to their people, understand their pain points. And the idea is not to villainize the IT department. While computer issues affect our productivity, calling the IT department for every little glitch also affects theirs. So we can all try to learn. Remember, in today's world, workplace technology is directly linked to employee engagement because employees care about their experience. They care about their tech experience at work too. For many, this is a big motivating factor, 62% to be precise. So companies must pay attention to technology because tech-rage employees aggressively shaking their computer screens don't make the ideal workplace. And finally, it's time for Vantage Shots, images that tell the story. We're starting with Europe. Another migrant boat has capsized there. This one came from Libya. In the US, California is facing one weather event after another. Some parts of the state are facing floods. Rescue efforts are underway. Meanwhile, the East African country of Malawi is dealing with the aftermath of Cyclone Freddy. The British Arctic Survey has released footage of the A81 iceberg. It is as big as London. And finally, 2 Spanish engineers are working on the first private reusable rocket. We're leaving you with these images. Thanks for watching. We'll see you tomorrow.
A70 bridge, I see. Additionally, when you're ready to land later, I have a bridge LZ ready for you.
Confirm, no need for...
All right.
Coming down. There you go. Just keep this line.
Would be a stretch.
Yeah, so, just 2 months back, democracy was alive and kicking in Himachal. Suddenly, it's, every time the Congress, a little more unelectable, democracy dies a little more. This doesn't hold water. It really, but having said that, Zaka, opposition leader of a country is fine in, when he or she visits abroad to point out things that are probably not working fine in the country, etc., etc. But this sweeping comments like democracy is dead and dying, these are alarmist. But the bigger problem is that Rahul Gandhi, Shama may disagree, but if he clearly is exhorting the Western powers, UK, US, that do something about it. What would you do? These are his words. What would you do if democracy is the size of Europe? Suddenly, democracy vanishes from Europe.
No, but the Congress is saying that he never said any such thing. The Congress is saying that it was not some plea for intervention.
No,
it was just that the so-called defenders of free speech, US, Europe, etc., they're not saying anything about what's happening in India.
No, and also this is not the first time that, Rahul Gandhi, I personally think that it was a very clear call for action for others in the world to do something about this thing, because we can't win elections. Most of the elections we are losing. So please come and do something about it. I have to be in power. That kind of a, to me, that is clear.
Okay, so let me ask Javed Ansari.
Shankar Iyer went to Pakistan and actually asked Pakistan, "Aap kuch kijiye." He is pleading with Pakistan to remove Modi.
So let me ask Javed Ansari that the government's argument is, you look at what has been happening, over the last few months, whether it was this Hindenburg report, now for whatever it's worth, the government is calling it a hit job. Then you had Mr. Soros and his comments.
Hello and welcome to the late night edition with me, Ayushman Singh Jambal. Our top focus is our neighbor Pakistan, where there was high drama on the streets of Lahore, where hundreds of cops were deployed as former Pakistan Prime Minister Imran Khan faces imminent arrest. Ladies and gentlemen, police are at Imran Khan's residence at Lahore's